Now let's call the speakers and Professor William Waissmann, who will lead the discussion. Good afternoon to all. Thank you very much for the speeches. Let's try to inaugurate this session. I would like to make a ask a general question. Basically, starting with Ronald's presentation, with several possibilities of focusing, of approaches in a more conceptual and generic way, and the several modes or ways to face these possibilities showed by Alan, with all difficulties we have to face by this reality, and also the elegant manner Montserrat is approaching toxicological issues. I would like to ask a question. If the president of the countries, of all our countries, or the legislative, would ask us to make a petition or an order of or initial organization of a proposal to start a work in terms of regulation in nanotechnology, which would be the 2 or 3 first aspects we should consider? I ask the question to the 3 of you.
Well, I think clearly regulation is actually starting to happen in the United States for carbon nanotubes, and it's because there is at least good evidence that carbon nanotubes are unique from other carbon fibers, and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, as you heard earlier, is starting to move forward with regulating them. They're also, I think, now starting to recognize that they need to be more proactive in terms of regulating potentially, in some fashion, some of the other nanomaterials, and are now actually in the next several months going to be proposing some regulations under the Toxic Substances Control Act to try and start to address these issues. I think clearly we need to have an integrated approach to regulation, which means we need to certainly encourage, where we can, self-regulation, but in terms of a formal governmental regulatory process, I think we need to look, for example, at the approach of generating more information, and the European approach under REACH, which requires that industry prepare risk assessments and regulatory assessments in terms of providing at least some of the basic data for chemical substances, is certainly one approach that needs to be considered. Right now, REACH characterizes materials based on volume of material produced, and so far, with maybe a few exceptions, most nanomaterials aren't produced in 10 tons or even 1 ton production levels, and frankly, I think the issue of how to regulate them under REACH is going to be reconsidered. That's my sense of where things are likely to go, because there's a recognition that nanomaterials are somewhat different than other chemicals in terms of the production volumes, and they need to be addressed in some different fashion, and at least incorporated into REACH in some fashion. So certainly having the information produced by industry is going to be key. If we require government to decide and make a demonstration that a nanomaterial presents an unreasonable hazard or risk, it puts the burden on government, and that, I think, effectively has not worked, even for chemicals, let alone for nanomaterials. So certainly getting more information available and putting the requirement on manufacturers to develop that information and provide that information is going to be key. I think we will be also looking to prioritize which materials need to be addressed. There needs to be some kind of screening approach. I think we're still struggling with how to achieve that. But OECD is moving forward, as we heard, with a variety of approaches to toxicity testing. I think ultimately they will at least, hopefully in the near future, provide some guidance on how to at least get a handle on some screening approaches for toxicity testing. And hopefully those can be incorporated into a regulatory framework as well.
Yeah? Okay. I would suggest the following. One is that to emulate the requirement for pesticides, even before any regulation, to require that any new compound that's introduced into production or commerce must be accompanied by methods for characterization. That's required of pesticides in the US. Number two, I think there needs to be an investment in toxicology and exposure assessment equal to the investment that has been made in research and development of the materials. And that, I mean, is a social investment. I think that investment could involve collaborations between academic institutions and industry under conditions of complete transparency. And as part of that investment, I think a substantial percentage should go to the issue of exposure and developing biomarkers to understand exposure in both the environment and in human populations. And the last one I'd like to speak to, and I know that there are several in the audience who share this burden, that for those of us who are journal editors, we should require and resolve the issues of incomplete annotation and use of reference standards. This was done by the academic community in terms of omics, so that we straightened out the weeds that had grown in all the studies of gene expression and proteomics by requiring standardization of reporting. And we need to do this immediately. I speak to my fellow editors here in the field of nanotoxicology.
I agree with Dr. Silbergeld that there is a need of investment, of this investment that is not parallel to the development and the creation of more products that are already in society and that are already in use. This is the point. Actually, William asked in terms of governors, so we should think that the non-investment in science and toxicology can be a passive for the future society with unforeseen consequences regarding nanoparticles on one hand side. On the other hand side, we also have a reality that a large quantity of products are already commercialized. Nowadays, we have evidences that if we wash a tissue with nano silver, there is a release of silver in the water, and this water comes to the environment. In my opinion, this should be on the top of the legislation needs right now. The other issue appears even more which are the simulation studies. We have to recognize a serious problem that under the analytical point of view, it is very difficult to detect nanoparticles in engineering in the environment. How are you going to characterize a risk if you don't have an analytical capacity to detect it? So the possibilities are which use exists, which are the products that are used more, and how can we make a reference in the possibility to make them enter into the environment. They could have a priority in terms of toxicological characterization. And the other point refers to which toxicological capacity we have. The teacher mentioned to think fast, to act very fast, rapidly. How are we going to do this? Maybe we should think on biological models that are easier or more expeditious to detect toxicological responses. For instance, nowadays we have, if we think of C ligands, transgenics, that can give us a big answer or a luminic or a fluorescent response that is indicating toxicity, a specific toxicity. These models can be cheap. This is not an expensive issue, and it's a biological system that can generate data in a very fast pace. We have to elect a kind of analysis or methodology of high production, I believe. I think that would be important, William. Which methodology, which action we can establish, enabling us to generate toxicology data with quality and fast. Okay. First of all, I would like to thank for the speeches. This was a sequence of 3 different levels of complexity. It was really very interesting, starting with frameworks, which I don't know how to translate into Portuguese, and the subtleness of the fact that really happens in the relationship of nanoparticles with the environment, going through attitudes that Professor Silbergeld showed us. I would like to repeat this question. How did you ask to transform this into regulation frameworks, which would be the first steps, right? I would like to emphasize these questions. How do such complex frameworks become into protocols? Instead of running twice as fast, shouldn't we run a marathon in the rhythm of 100 meters only? Well,
okay. Just for your last comment, I think you can run too fast and you can fall and you can run down the wrong street. And I think we are all mindful of the potential promise of this technology, and therefore we want to be quick, but we want to be accurate at the same time. I'm not sure we're ready to, we have frameworks for regulation in all our countries. The question is, how do we build the decoration on this framework? And I think before we talk about the frameworks, the point of my talk was to remind us how far behind we are and how far we are from delivering the promise of the information to fill the complex systems of decision-making that Ron White described. So I do not want us to skip over the burden to our field as scientists and the extraordinary obligation that I think we have avoided by, focusing on how are we going to regulate. The fable of who will bell the cat? You know, the mice are all sitting around and the cat has been terrorizing them, and the idea comes, well, we'll put a bell on the cat and then we will know when it's coming. But how do we do that? I am at the level of saying we need to build the methods and the data to put the bell on the cat.
So I think it's a very good question in terms of how do we actually actualize the frameworks. And I think, again, we certainly need data. The question is, who is going to provide the data? Where is that going to come from? The reality is that there's a role for government in supporting that, and we've heard now several times that there needs to be a significant increase in government support for environmental health and safety research. But I would tell you that I think it's also incumbent on the manufacturers of the nanomaterials to also develop that. And I think some of the larger manufacturers like DuPont have done, as you can see from the information that was presented by Dr. Warheit, are really stepping up to the plate, as it were, and contributing to the scientific information that's necessary. That's not necessarily true of many of the other manufacturers of nanomaterials. And if they have that data, they're certainly not sharing it in a very public way. So I think the issue of where the information is going to come from to be able to fill in those frameworks is going to be key. And I think the issue is whether it will be a reach type approach where the burden is going to be on industry to provide that data, or whether it's going to be more of the approach that, for example, exists primarily in the US with the exception of pesticides, where for chemicals, the burden is on government to basically generate the data to demonstrate that there's a potential health or environmental hazard associated with the product. And I think that's a fundamental issue of where the resources are going to come from to provide this data gap that we've all recognized exists for nanomaterials. I think work can begin on standardizing some testing, and I think that's going to continue. That will be a key piece of a regulatory approach. You need to have some sort of standardized protocol in place. Whether it'll be the OECD tests or some other kind of protocol remains to be seen.
We don't have time anymore. Let's just ask another couple of questions because we still have another presentation. We have a teacher behind us here.
Graham Hodge from Australia. I just want to reorient some of our conversation. I'm getting the feeling that people don't believe nanomaterials are regulated, and I think they already are through multiple frameworks. We have laws that cover chemicals. We have laws that cover food. It's not legal, for example, in Australia to sell food that harms people, or to put food in packaging that harms people. So we have a series of laws at the moment. We have insurance companies and so on. And I have to say, the insurance companies refused to cover asbestos producers in Canada 25 years before governments enacted legislation. So there are a whole series of regulatory frameworks in place in every country. So the first step that Brazil ought to take, in my view, is to look at its existing laws and the regulations that hang off those laws and ask the question, where are the gaps and are the triggers that we need? Okay? After you've done that, I think there's a whole lot of very sensible and necessary ways of using information that we've heard from the panel about toxicity, about exposure, about monitoring and so on. But until you've passed that first stage of knowing what your own regulatory regimes cover, you can't get to the next stage, which is having a debate about how effective they are.
Well, I have to respond and say that we have nanomaterials in all kinds of products, some of which come into direct contact with humans, at least in my country, and I think in yours as well, and they have not been subject to any exercise of regulatory authority. Now, if you want to say it's a matter of politics, perhaps, is it a matter of some of the preliminary stages of denial that I suggested could be operating? But to say that they are regulated, I think with respect is not true. To say that the potential for regulation exists in law books, I will grant that that is true, but many things exist in books that do not protect societies.
Yeah.
More questions?
Yes.
Paulo Martins from the Research Nanotechnology Network. My question is to Professor Ronald. In your curriculum, you mentioned you acted towards environmental justice. I think you also work with this aspect. So my question is, how do you establish this relationship between nanotechnology or nanoparticles, toxicities, referring to nanoparticles, and the issue of the environmental justice?
Hello? Yeah. Okay. So, to be honest, I don't think there's been much attention on the issue of environmental justice for nanomaterials. I think traditionally, at least in the United States, the focus has been on environmental pollutants and the exposure of certain populations, whether they be minority populations or low socioeconomic status populations, to an extraordinarily higher burden of environmental pollutants. Nanomaterials, I think, is kind of interesting because the exposures there may not necessarily, we don't have the information right now on what people are being exposed to in terms of nanoparticles. We don't really know, for example, whether there's a higher exposure in certain types of populations to nanomaterials than others. I would actually suspect that it's actually the more wealthy population that may be exposed to higher levels of nanomaterials, given their use of cosmetics, and nano-based cosmetics are very expensive. And some of the other products that contain nanomaterials are in fact higher costing products. So this may be a case actually where the most highly exposed population, we can speculate, although I don't think there's any data to support it, is in fact not the low SES populations, the low socioeconomic status population, but may in fact be in fact a more wealthy population. I don't know, but I could certainly postulate and make a case for why that might be the case. I think ultimately it may be, though, in terms of disposal of nanomaterials, that it will be low socioeconomic populations that are going to be most affected, not by use, but by the waste of nanomaterials. And I think that needs to be looked at because, as we know, as these cosmetics and other products, and in some cases these nano products will be incinerated, and so the materials will go into the air, it may very well be that the populations that are more traditionally exposed to the waste products in the environment, which are low SES populations, are going to be in fact exposed through that end of the process to higher levels of nanomaterials. But right now I don't think we have any data on any of that. We really, I mean, as little as we know about toxicity of nanomaterials, we know even less about who's being exposed to nanomaterials, probably at least outside of the workplace. I mean, I think in the workplace there's good work going on at NIOSH in the US and in other countries as well in terms of characterizing workplace exposure. But in terms of population exposure, we know very, very, very little. And I think that's frankly one of the areas that's going to need a lot more attention before we can figure out who the most exposed populations really are.
Last question, Professor.
Okay. To Dr. Jose Maria. Correct me if I'm wrong. You were talking about oxidative stress in the brain after exposure of silver particles, nanoparticles. Is it right? In your aquatic species?
We measure a total antioxidant capacity in brain of fish exposed to silver nanoparticles dissolved in water. Now we are measuring the oxidized proteins and chibars just to verify if the lowering of the total antioxidant capacity is
Okay, I have a question to this end. Like, what is the mechanism behind of these oxidations? Because, it's not transition metal. How you can explain me what is behind this oxidative stress? How
There-
just like it's not radical, probably.
There is some studies that talks about the affinity bisulfhydryl groups of silver. So if you gain, if you reduce the content of sulfhydryl groups, you can perhaps goes to a more pro-oxidant condition because you are reducing the sulfhydryl groups. There is, for example, you have studies from that were published in this year that they measure total sulfhydryl groups and non-protein sulfhydryl groups in zebrafish exposed to silver nanoparticles, and they show a clear reduction. So you are turning to a pro-oxidant condition.
And second question, if you allow me. You're talking about like pro and antioxidant property, talking about fullerenes. That it would be very much easy for me to understand what is redox potential of these materials compared to any ascorbate or any glutathione sulfur-containing compound. And the last question, which I was questioning, you're talking about singlet oxygen production and quenching. What is the chemistry behind of this mechanism? Because single oxygen is like very short-lived, it's 10 to 9. And it's kind of very difficult to just find out the way and what's the mechanism of quenching.
Yeah, I don't know really. In fact, we have to characterize more precisely that using an scavenger, yes, but using an ex vivo model in gills of zebrafish, we observe a similar response. When we measure lipid peroxidation in gills of zebrafish exposed to fullerene and UV radiation, the peak of chivars was reduced using sodium azide. So there is an effect that is reduced when we employed sodium azide.
Thank you to all speakers. Let's have a coffee break, or let's go to the next session.